Greetings, everyone. Really wonderful to have this opportunity to speak with you. These conversations across cultures and across countries are so important as so many of us around the world try to figure out the best way to serve the 1.6 billion learners that have had their schooling interrupted and challenged by the outbreak of COVID-19. My name is Justin Reich. I'm a faculty member at MIT, and I run a lab called the Teaching Systems Lab, and we aspire to design, implement, and research the future of teacher learning. And I'm the author of a recent book, Failure to Disrupt: Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education. It was a book that I finished copy editing in March of 2020, March of this past year. And so it is from before the pandemic. It looks at the recent history of education technology, tries to identify the way it has and has not fulfilled its promises, but then also tries to look forward to the future. There were some very tense moments as I was getting ready to turn back in my copy edits, where I wondered, will the predictions that I made in this book just be totally upended by the pandemic? And it turned out that I didn't change very much. And I think it worked out reasonably well that that was the case. I think the book can do is explain why online learning, remote learning for so many families and students has been really such a disappointment during the pandemic, and what brighter futures might look like. So let me share some slides with you and some thoughts here. And then hopefully we'll find other ways to converse together. So over the course of the last 2 decades, there have been some dramatic claims made by education technology evangelists about how new learning tools, how new forms of online learning might transform education. So in 2009, Harvard Business School professor Clay Christensen claimed that by 2019, half of all secondary classes in the United States would be taught in an online or blended format, that they would cost a third as much to provision, and that they would lead to better outcomes. In the years when massive open online courses, Coursera and edX and Xinhuax were beginning to blossom, Sebastian Thrun, a researcher at Stanford and Google and the founder of Udacity, said that one day there might be only 10 institutions of higher education left in the world, and Udacity might be one of them. Sal Khan, well known in the United States for founding Khan Academy, in 2011 gave a TED Talk where he said, let's use technology to reinvent education. Let's have students sit by themselves in front of machines and learn math through algorithmically optimized pathways, with teachers periodically pulling students together for enrichment or remediation and projects. And we can re-engineer the learning system to have every student operate at their own path and pace. Sugata Mitra, who won the 2013 TED Prize, in some senses went further than all of these folks and said, we don't even need schools or institutions of learning, that groups of students with laptops that are connected to the internet can teach anything themselves. So these were the claims that were out there. And then in 2020, the world was blighted by a global pandemic. 1.6 billion learners had their schooling interrupted. And what became of online learning, remote learning during this period? One way to frame the education technology evangelists' claim is that new technologies would be better than the existing system of education pre-pandemic. Now, you could think of their claims as saying, shouldn't these technologies be better than a hobbled, broken, pandemic-constrained education system? Overwhelmingly, I have not seen education systems turn to new technologies. We've seen some individual adoption of massive open online courses, but not widespread institutional adoption. We haven't seen a dramatic change in the institutional use of algorithm-guided adaptive tutors, intelligent tutors. I don't know anywhere in the world where groups of children with laptops are just teaching themselves anything they want or the curriculum. Instead, from what I've observed, the response to the pandemic has been dominated by two technologies. And they are two of the oldest, most well-established technologies we have. One are learning management systems. These are tools in the US like Canvas, Google Classroom, Schoology, that basically allow teachers and students to pass documents back and forth with one another. And then the second dominant technology, when it was introduced in the 1930s, was called video telephony. Things like Zoom and Microsoft Teams, Google Meets. I'm sure there are Chinese alternatives to all of these tools. And overwhelmingly, what we've seen pedagogically, especially in higher education and secondary schools, is not any kind of ushering in of brand new technologies, not any kind of dramatic reorganization of educational systems, but for the most part, faculty members walked away from their podiums and their lecterns, sat down in front of their home office webcams, and kept teaching the way they had been teaching before. In the United States, in Hong Kong, in other places, I've been on a number of panels called Reimagining Education, the dawn of online learning, or other panels that are out there, other kinds of conferences. And to me, the discussion of reimagination and reinvention just stands in such stark contrast to what we've witnessed across the world, which is probably the most dramatic, powerful demonstration of the conservatism of educational systems that any of us will see in our lifetimes. What educators, what schools, what colleges use technology to do is to reproduce as closely as they possibly could the conditions of a typical face-to-face classroom through synchronous, a little bit of asynchronous learning. We have tried to conserve. We have tried to recreate what we've lost rather than imagining something that might be new or different. We might critique that. We might celebrate that educators have a form that they trust that works well and that they've tried to recreate that in a different way. But I think empirically, observationally, we can say that there has not been a disruption, a transformation of our systems using new technologies. There has been a powerful desire to conserve. I think there are some virtues to be found in this inclination to build upon what already exists in education systems. Many people have watched one of Sal Khan's TED Talks. Far fewer have read this interview that he gave with District Administrator magazine in the beginning of 2018. So District Administrator magazine is a very small trade magazine for superintendents, for municipal and district leaders, mostly in the United States. And one of the things that Sal Khan did in between founding Khan Academy and now is he built his own school. It's a private school in Silicon Valley called the Khan Lab School, something like that. And he talked with district administrator about his own experience in his own school trying to bring about these transformational new ideas. And he says, now that I run a school, I see that some of the stuff is not as easy to accomplish compared to how it sounds theoretically. It's taken me in the Khan Academy longer to realize this, but not everyone can easily move to a mastery-based, self-paced learning environment. That's hard to do overnight. More recently, he says, what he's been encouraging folks to do is to teach math in their traditional, regular way, 4 days a week, and then 1 day a week, use Khan Academy for practice problems. And he argued that that was a good balance of something that helps improve math learning outcomes using technology, but is also doable and realistic. Now, when I read that, one of the things that struck me about that argument is that other folks had made it 25 years beforehand. Ken Kadinger, who is at Carnegie Mellon University, did a series of experiments in the Pittsburgh public schools in the early 1990s, where they developed adaptive math tutors, math practice problem software, put them in schools. They told teachers to teach normally 3 days a week and then use the intelligent tutors 2 days a week. And the teachers didn't quite do that. They mostly did 4 days a week of regular teaching and 1 day a week of the practice problems on computers. And they got a little bit of a bump in math scores, particularly on the subjects that were the focus of the adaptive tutors. Another way to put this is that, Khan Academy has had something like $150 million of philanthropic investment over the last 10 years. And much of what they learned, they could have found out with a trip to the library. People have been using computers to try to teach other people since the dawn of the computing era, since computers were the size of your living room. And we are not on the cusp of a brand new wave of technology that's going to transform educational systems. Instead, our very best hope is that we will make incremental, continuous improvement to a suite of learning technologies that are not sweeping, that are not transformative, but they can be useful, like these math tutors, for particular learners, in particular subjects, in particular contexts. My colleague Morgan Ames at the University of California, Irvine, has a beautiful book just out about the One Laptop Per Child program called The Charisma Machine. And one of the arguments that Morgan makes is that there's two kinds of stances that technologists tend to take towards new technologies. Sal Khan, 2011, represents the charismatic stance, the belief that technology disrupts and transforms existing systems, that the future will be brand new and different because of technology. And Sal Khan in 2019 represents something more like the tinkering stance. And the tinkerers tend to believe that existing school systems domesticate new technologies. They recruit new technologies to do the work of the existing systems, not to reinvent the systems. They take new technologies and slot them into existing niches for particular students, particular subjects, particular purposes. If you believe in this view of tinkering, then the future, even one shaped, disrupted, transformed by a pandemic, is likely to be an extension of trends from history that we shouldn't be surprised to see in the midst of a pandemic, that new technologies are used to extend existing practices, because that's what teachers have almost always done with new technologies. So my book, Failure to Disrupt, tries in a sense to celebrate this tinkering mindset. It says, look, perhaps there's something ambitious and interesting around the charismatic stance, but the problem with the charismatic stance is it never seems to pan out. It never leads to these kinds of dramatic changes. A better way to think about making school systems better, a better way to think about improving schools with technology, is to think of this as incremental, shoulder to the wheel kind of work that needs to go on year after year, generation after generation. And we can make a difference. We can make learning better. There are things that educators are learning during the pandemic which will serve students for many years ahead, but not through a transformed system, but through an iteratively, continuously improved system. With my colleague Jal Mehta at Harvard, we wrote a report that tries to inspire educators to bring this kind of thinking about continuous improvement to schools during the pandemic. We called the report Imagining September. And it was created by pulling together a bunch of working groups of different stakeholders in education. We believe that the best responses to the pandemic are going to be ones that school systems co-construct with teachers, with families, with educators, with librarians, and with students. There's exactly one generation of students around the world that has gone to school online, remote, during the midst of a pandemic. And those are the children who are in our classrooms right now. And we should talk with them about their experiences, and we should co-construct our response together. So on the basis of these conversations, we came up with a series of 7 different principles for, at the time we said reading school. But I also think these principles can apply to all of the moments in a school year when we rethink and reshape our thinking. The beginning of a new calendar year, the beginning of a new quarter or semester or marking period, the moments in which we make somewhat bigger changes in how we do school. One of the arguments that we made is that now might be a good time to review and re-examine our curriculum priorities. In most places in the world, students will not learn as much in 2020, 2021 as they did in previous years. They're not in school as often. They don't have as much contact with their teachers. They are dealing with pandemic and recession, job loss, illness, a wide variety of challenges. They're just not going to learn as much. One realistic way to encounter this is to say, well, then let's be really deliberate and make sure that if we have to do less, that we do fewer things well. Conveniently, when my colleague Jal Mehta, in a wonderful book called In Search of Deeper Learning, studies what the best US schools look like with very different traditions. Some of them more instructionist, focused on direct instruction. Some of them more project-based, hands-on. Across that spectrum, many of the best schools in the United States have a belief that a good education does fewer things really well, dives deep into fewer topics rather than being spread across many of them. So in the United States, many of us are quite taken by the work of Marie Kondo, the home organizing expert. She's a Japanese woman who has a routine where in Americans' overstuffed closets, she asks them to walk into their closet, put your hand on a piece of clothing and see if it sparks joy. And if it doesn't spark joy, you need to fold up that dress or that skirt or that shirt and say thank you to it and throw it or give it away. We've tried to encourage schools in the United States to Marie Kondo their curriculum, to go through the curriculum, put your hand on each piece and ask if it sparks joy. And if it doesn't, fold it up neatly, put it in the dustbin, and make more room, make more space for a deeper investigation of fewer things. Another piece of advice that we've given schools that aligns with this tinkering mindset is that it's an incredibly important time for iterative organizational learning. Another characteristic that our best schools have is that they are what Peter Senge calls learning organizations, places where the work of the school is not just about having kids learn, but it's about having all of the adults, all of the stakeholders, families, community, engaged in a process of learning as well. The schools that are going to have the most effective response to the pandemic, that will be most resilient moving into the future, will be schools that are really good at this kind of iterative, ongoing, continuous learning. So these are challenges that we share across many different places in the globe. In this moment of turbulence, it's worth giving due consideration to the tinkerer's mindset. What would it look like to look at the pandemic, to look at the incredible conservative reaction of schools to the pandemic and say, we can do better, but we're going to do better with a shoulder to the wheel approach, with an approach that doesn't expect new technologies to come in and sweep away the past and have a new system unfold instead, but instead believes that our technologies are only as powerful as the communities of educators that guide their use. And that the real blossoming of educational systems is not going to come from new apps or AI or virtual reality, but is going to come to a renewed dedication of creating powerful learning experiences for educators, supporting educators in their creative, ongoing, iterative response to this crisis, and to design that response not just from the top down, but through a collaborative, multi-stakeholder, design-based participatory approach. I hope those provocations are helpful to you in thinking about your response to the pandemic. And I hope that I have a chance to join you in person to try to discuss some of these issues. But if not, I hope we can find other kinds of electronic ways to connect in the days and weeks ahead.